The Columbian Exchange is named after Christopher Columbus because this is a two-way exchange. It goes in both directions. It is from Old World to New World and from New World to Old World. So looking at this map, this is the New World, the Western Hemisphere. This is the Old World, the Eastern Hemisphere. Goods, ideas, people, diseases were exchanged across these two hemispheres. So this is a two-way street. It goes in both directions. Now, who benefited the most from this exchange? That would be Europe 100%. Who suffered the most under this exchange? Either the New World, or you could argue Africa had a bunch of disadvantages that occurred from this. Okay, but in terms of numbers, I think the Native Americans were hit demographically due to disease, although the Asiento does play a huge demographic negative role in the continent of Africa. Okay, so you're responsible in this Columbian Exchange, not only knowing the two-way exchange, but also knowing the three legs of the triangular trade. Why is it called the triangular trade? Because it makes a triangle. Okay, the first stop is Europe. So we start in Europe and go to Africa. Then it's from Africa to the New World. Then from the New World back to Europe. Okay, so that's why it's called the triangular trade. You're responsible for knowing these legs and what was traded on these legs, what was exchanged. So first leg, Europe to Africa. The Europeans were bringing manufactured goods. Manufactured means that they had to create it using raw materials. It wasn't something you could find in nature. So things like guns and alcohol. Don't find guns in nature. They don't grow on trees, right? So Europe manufactures these goods and then they take them to Africa to trade. Now, do they use these guns to conquer African kingdoms? No, because remember, the Europeans can't colonize Africa like they colonized the Americas. Okay, why is that? Malaria. Okay, the Bantu migration had spread not only malaria through Africa, but also sickle cell disease, which lent itself to immunity against malaria. The Europeans don't have that immunity. So the Europeans get malaria and they die to death, right? Why couldn't the Europeans use their military technology to take over Africa? Africa had the same military technology. Gunpowder technology had spread through the Mongolian conquest. The old world had been trading stuff with each other, okay, across those three continents for tens of thousands of years. So the mighty empires in Africa, like Mali and Ghana and Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, they had the same military technology. So if Europe tried to come in and get fresh, okay, they would be fighting against people who were their equals or their superiors. Okay, so the Europeans could not colonize Africa. So Portugal resigned itself to establishing a trading post empire along the coast of Africa rather than the interior of Africa. Remember that Africa had major exports of gold and ivory and of slaves. But it's important to note that old world slavery is different from New World slavery. Okay, under Old World slavery, the people who were slaves were prisoners of war, debtors, criminals, witches, and slavery was not racial. It was not based on race. It was not hereditary. So the child of a slave did not automatically become a slave, and it was not permanent. So if you had sold yourself into slavery to pay off a debt, then once you paid off that debt, you're free again. Okay, so it could be for a temporary period of time. It was also not nearly as deadly. Remember that in Africa, there wasn't a concept of land ownership. Individuals didn't own the land. The land belonged to the community. So if you can't use property or land specifically to show off your wealth, how do you show that you have wealth? Well, by your ability to support your family. Okay, so polygamy in Africa that allowed for men to have many wives and many children. By being able to support that immense number of wives and children, okay, up to 4 wives, that shows that you are wealthy, that you could take care of your family. They also could show their wealth by the number of people that they owned. Okay, because they would have to be able to supply food and shelter and other life essentials in order to support the people that they had owned as property. So old world slavery, very different from new world slavery. This is where we see a change over time. When the Portuguese start the Asiento, which is the African slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean, some things change. Now it's not just prisoners of war, debtors, or criminals. It's anyone that they can capture in Africa, okay? And it becomes based on race. It becomes hereditary. It becomes permanent. And it becomes extremely deadly. About 50% of the people who were transported across the Middle Passage, and the Middle Passage is the second leg from Africa to the Americas. Around 50% or more people who were captured and taken over to the Americas died en route. Okay, so died on the ships. Okay, then once they arrive in the Americas, the average life expectancy of a person working in the Brazilian sugar plantations for the Portuguese was 1 to 2 years. Okay, so extremely deadly. And that's because for the Portuguese, it was cheaper for them to work the population that they had captured to death rather than keep them alive. Okay, especially keeping them alive long enough in order to replenish the population. Okay, so New World slavery based on race, hereditary, permanent, that's supposed to be an A, and it is far more deadly. And this is going to be extremely disruptive to the African continent for a number of reasons. Number one, you have an influx of weapons. So that increases conflict, especially as the African slave raiders run out of people from the bottom rungs of society that traditionally made up the slave class. Okay, African kingdoms go to war against other African kingdoms in order to capture more prisoners of war to sell as slaves. Once the lower classes that are typically a part of the slave class are depleted by the Portuguese demand for slaves, the African slave traders start grabbing from higher ranks in society. So even the elites and the noble classes they run the risk of being captured and sold to the Portuguese. So it's disruptive demographically, it's disruptive politically, and also the majority of the people who were captured and enslaved were the male gender. Okay, so you see a decrease in the male gender in Africa. Right, so that is disruptive for 2 reasons. Number one, it disrupts the patriarchy a little bit, and that women end up filling that power vacuum. They start taking positions of authority in Africa due to the spaces that are left empty. And also the practice of polygamy increases in Africa. There's not enough husbands to go around, so there are multiple wives. And that's able to help replenish the population that has been stolen from the continent. Okay. So this slave trade, highly disruptive to the African continent. Then in the second leg, the Middle Passage, that's when we have the enslaved peoples who were bought by the Europeans along the African coast, are transported to the Americas and forced to work on plantations. Now, the Portuguese, since they owned the Asiento, they're going to be importing a higher number of enslaved Africans than the Spanish, because the Portuguese don't have to pay as much for it, whereas it is more expensive for the Spanish. So instead of the Spanish relying on the Asiento, at first the Spanish rely on enslaving the native populations that are already in the Americas. And what system did the Spanish use to enslave the Native Americans? What was the name of the coerced labor system? Good, the encomienda. But the issue with the encomienda, beyond just the moral issue, was that the Native American population was decreasing due to both conquest and the spread of disease. So eventually the Spanish are going to start using the asiento in order to maintain their profits. Y'all, I just got an email from the front office saying that the schedule for next week is going to be the alternating maroon and gold days, with maroon being odd and gold being even. And Monday is going to be a gold day. So y'all are gold, which means your test is still on Monday. My odd classes, 3rd and 7th period, their test is going to be on Tuesday. Make sense? Okay, and I'll go find that schedule and post it on Schoology to help keep track, because we don't have the noon to 3 p.m. period anymore with that schedule. I think it goes back to we're completely like first period meets every day, and then we meet for the rest of the day, whether it's gold or maroon, if I recall correctly. Okay, so the encomienda system is not going to be as productive due to the declining demographics of the New World, due to the arrival of disease and also conquest. And so that's going to lead to an increase in the asiento, higher demand by the Portuguese in Africa. Then the third leg, what goes from America to Europe? Okay, that's going to be raw materials. Raw materials are things that you find in nature. So gold and silver, they are found in mines, silver and gold mines. Cash crops like sugar, tobacco, coffee, okay, that's going to be grown in the Americas through coerced labor, and that doesn't enrich the Americas, okay? The Americas don't get to keep any of that gold and silver or the profit that's generated by cash crops. Under mercantilism, the purpose of the colonies is to enrich the mother countries in Europe, Portugal and Spain. So those raw materials go from the Americas to Europe, where they're then used to create manufactured goods. What can sugar be manufactured into? Alcohol, rum. Okay, and so this starts the cycle, the triangular trade, all over again. By using the sugar that they get from the Americas, they're able to manufacture more alcohol, which they then take to Africa to exchange for enslaved peoples. Then they go to the Americas and use that forced labor to grow more cash crops. Okay, so it's a cycle. So the triangular trade are these three legs. You need to know which one's the first one, which one's the second one, which one's the third one, and what was exchanged on those legs. But the Columbian exchange as a whole was stuff from New World going to Old World and stuff from Old World going to New World. Remember that Europe and Africa are a part of the Old World along with Asia. Okay, so keep that in mind. Are we good so far? So if you're given an essay talking about continuity and change over time or cause and effect, okay, if it asks you to talk about the causes and effects of the Columbian exchange, you can't just say there were many causes and there were many effects. You can't just say there were bad effects. You have to be specific, okay? The main causes were economic, political, and religious causes for God, glory, and gold. And then for effects, you can talk about the negative demographic effects for Africa and the Americas. You can talk about the positive economic effects for Europe. Okay, all of that is specific. So make sure that you're creating those categories. For continuity and change over time, you could talk about how there were demographic changes in the New World. It used to be completely Native Americans, with Native Americans holding positions in the social hierarchy from the top, middle, and the bottom, to now you have Native Americans and Africans and Europeans in the New World. And the Native Americans no longer hold positions in all areas of society. They're relegated to the lower levels as the Europeans take over. Change over time in terms of demographics of the Native American population. They decrease significantly due to the spread of disease and conquest and enslavement. Okay. What about Oceania and Australia? Australia is a part of the old world. Okay, we don't really talk too much about Australia in our curriculum. Most of Oceania was in the time period that got cut out from our curriculum. So we really don't talk that much about Australia other than it gets colonized by the British and the British use it as a big jail. They basically send everyone they don't want in Britain to Australia as punishment because everything in Australia will try to kill you. Everything. Like they've got scorpions the size of shoes or small dogs. Everything's on fire. If a kangaroo kicks you, y'all, you will die to death. Have y'all ever seen like a picture of a real life kangaroo? Y'all, they are swole. They are massive. Hold on, now we gotta pull this up. I hope this is the video that I put in the recording. Okay, kangaroos. I'm gonna give y'all an essay and y'all just be like, Australia have kangaroos that can kill you. Horses are also weirdly muscular. All right, hold on. Share screen. Y'all, look at that buff kangaroo. Yeah, he doesn't skip arm day. That's for sure. Whatever workout he's doing. And also they can use their tail as like a third leg. Like they can use it for balance. Very impressive. Also, did y'all know that kangaroos' pockets aren't like a pocket? It's not like you open it and then there's just like more fur lining it. It just straight up goes into the kangaroo. Like it goes into their guts. I'm not going to pull it up on images because it's really gross. But if you want to look that up on your own time, that's a you thing. All right, back to a regularly scheduled program. What were we talking about other than kangaroos? Oh, change over time. Yeah, so you could talk about those specific categories. Okay, don't just say, yeah, there were causes and effects. Like, duh. That's like answering an essay question with yes. Like, no, we know that it's yes or no. You need to explain how and why. Okay. Alrighty, next let's talk about the European countries that emerge at the forefront of exploration. First is Portugal. Okay, even though Portugal is smaller than Spain, they were the first to start this whole age of exploration, right? Mostly due to the sponsorship by Prince Henry, the Navigator. Okay, so he was the Prince of Portugal. Well, let me change that to blue. And in the midst of the Dark Ages, 1419, even before the Renaissance got kicked off, Prince Henry recognized that Europe was behind and that everywhere else had had a golden age and that Europe had to catch up. So how do we catch up and become an empire? Well, we need trade. We need access to the most profitable trade. And at that time, that trade was in Asia, specifically the Indian Ocean routes. Now, what was in Asia that the Europeans wanted so badly? Okay, so gunpowder did culturally diffuse out of Asia through the Mongolian conquest, but that wasn't what they were mainly there to trade for, specifically in Southeast Asia. Good, with the Spice Islands, the spice trade. So they desperately wanted those spices. Spices could be used to preserve food. They could be used as incense. They could be used as medicine. Okay, so there's a high demand for those spices. Now, Italy had a monopoly on the European access to Asian trade through the Mediterranean sea lanes. So they can't go through the Mediterranean Sea. And they also can't go through the Silk Road without the Muslims, namely the Ottoman empires, charging them a bunch of money for the right to use that trade route. And so he wants to find an all-water route, a maritime route, excuse me. to Asia. And so with that, he starts a school for navigation where they take technology from the East in order to expand their knowledge base and build upon that technology for the goal of finding a maritime route. They take gunpowder, they take the compass, the lateen sails, the astrolabe, all of that maritime technology, and they bring it over to Europe. And so lateen sails in particular are going to be combined with square sails in Europe to create a new ship, the caravel. So that's an example of synchronism. You take the square sail of Europe, the lateen sail, which is triangular from China, combine them together to create something new, a new type of ship that is lighter and faster and better suited to traveling up and down the African coastline. So at first, Prince Henry the Navigator starts funding these expeditions along the coastline due to the export of gold in Africa. So at the very beginning, he's interested in gold. Then eventually he's going to develop a trading post empire along the coast of Africa to allow for explorers like Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama to find a route around Africa to Asia. Now, with that trading post empire, even though the Portuguese are able to establish ports along the African coast, they're not able to conquer Africa. They're not able to invade the interior of Africa for the reasons we stated before. Malaria was a push factor, keeping them out, and also the fact that the African empires wouldn't let them. They had the same technology, okay? And so instead, they resign themselves, the Portuguese do, they resign themselves to establishing ports along the coast that they can then use to resupply as they make it to Asia. And then eventually, they're going to start the asiento, which is the African slave trade. Okay, the slave trade from Africa to the Americas that Portugal is going to dominate. Okay. But the historical significance of all of this stuff that Henry the Navigator does, is that it is the catalyst for the age of exploration. Portugal does it first. They find the route to India, and then Spain is like, oh snap, we got to find a route too. But we can't go south, we can't go east, we can't go north, so we're going to go west. Thus, in 1492, resulting in the Europeans finding out about the New World. Are we good so far? So some of the explorers and expeditions that Henry the Navigator and Portugal funded included Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama, and then following 1492, the exploration of the New World under Amerigo Vespucci. Okay, now Bartholomew Diaz was the first person that the Portuguese funded to find this maritime route to Asia, and he made it halfway there. He rounded the southern tip of Africa before his crowd mutinied and he had to go back to Portugal. So he makes it halfway there, but he never gets to complete that journey. After him, Vasco da Gama builds upon that route. He builds upon the route that Diaz had already set, and then he completes the other half of it, finally making it to the Indian Ocean. By that point, in 1498, the Spanish have already started building their maritime empire in the New World. So Portugal is going to focus a lot more heavily on Africa and not as much on the Americas. In fact, the colony that the Portuguese claim is Brazil, but then the Spanish get literally everything else in the New World. Okay, because they believe that their profits in Africa are going to surmount those found in America, which, spoiler alert, they're wrong. But due to finding this route to Asia, they're able to bring back Indian goods, creating a huge demand for those goods. Now, this is bad for Italy because Italy had been the European country with access to Asia. And as the only one with access to Asia, they were able to hold a monopoly. They were able to dominate that access. Now, they're not the only ones in town who can get to India. And so this hurts Italian profits. This hurts their economy. Okay, with the decline of their economy, that also hurts their government. All right, now we don't see an actual country of Italy develop until the 19th century, okay, until the 1870s. Germany and Italy are the last countries to unify in Europe. So they're decentralized and they're fragmented. This could be one of the causes of that decentralization. They were doing well economically until they lost that monopoly, and now they're out of the game. So it's going to be another 400 years before they even become a country. They're just a bunch of different city-states and the Catholic Church. We good so far? Okay. Now, why are the American continents called the Americas? Well, it's because of this dude, Amerigo Vespucci, who the Portuguese sent to explore their colony in Brazil. Now, even though Pedro Cabral, a year prior to that, had brought up the fact that, hey, maybe South America is a new continent, maybe this isn't Asia, like Columbus thought at first, one of the map makers in Europe is going to say that Vespucci was the first one to declare this, and so that's how it's written down in history, which is why we're called the Americas instead of the Cabralians or something, okay, because of that incorrect fact being, or that incorrection being made, and then everyone just kind of going with it, okay? So that's what's significant about the Vespucci. Are we good so far? So speaking of the Portuguese Empire, they did not claim a lot of land in the New World. They left that up mostly to Spain. Okay, Spain is up there taking up all that land like, oh, it's free real estate, right? But the Portuguese are focused more on Africa for their profits. So they do claim some of the New World, but compared to Spain, a much smaller percent. So what kind of profit are the Portuguese getting out of Brazil? Well, it's primarily going to be cash crops. Remember, cash crops are crops that are grown for profit, not because you need them to live. So coffee, cotton, tobacco, but most importantly in Brazil, sugar plantations. And sugar plantations were incredibly deadly, okay, incredibly dangerous. And so there is a high mortality rate, a high death rate in these plantations for the people that were working on those plantations. Now, was it Europeans or indentured servants or serfs that were working on these plantations? No, okay? The Portuguese, rather than use native labor, like the encomienda, instead focused on their trading port empire in Africa and built upon the asiento. Okay, so the natives were dying off from smallpox and other disease. The Portuguese owned the African slave trade known as the asiento, and so they're going to start importing people stolen from the continent of Africa. Okay, so a high volume of people being brought over to the New World, but also a high mortality rate, which requires them to keep going back to Africa and demanding more people. Okay, as a result of the asiento, we're going to see a big change over time. Okay, a big change over time, a demographic change. So let's look at the Americas prior to exploration. Prior to exploration, this entire social hierarchy was made up of Native Americans, and only Native Americans. Prior to 1492, there were no Europeans. There were no Africans. Okay, it was completely Aztec, Inca, Cahokians, Mississippian culture. It was all natives. What positions in society did the natives hold? All of them. The kings were Native American. The scribes were Native American. The slaves, the peasants, the merchants, the farmers, they were all the same race. They were all natives, the indigenous peoples. Okay, that changes with exploration. With exploration, a new hierarchy, instead of being based on status or what job you have, this new hierarchy known as the casta system is going to be based on race. Okay, casta system looks very familiar. It looks like the caste system in India. Again, the caste system in India developed as a racial hierarchy based on varna, or the color of someone's skin, with the Aryans of the Caucasus Mountains being higher in that social hierarchy than the native Dravidians, which were lower in that caste system. So we see something similar develop in the New World. So another change over time is who's in charge. It's no longer natives at the top of the hierarchy. Now it's Europeans. But there are two different classes of Europeans that emerge. You have the peninsulares. The key word in peninsulares is peninsula. This is referring to Europeans born in Europe, born in Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula. They hold the most authority in the Americas. Underneath them are Creoles. Creoles are people of European descent, what we today would call Caucasian people, but they weren't born in Europe. They were born in the New World. So even though racially they are the exact same as the peninsulares, because of where they were born, they become second-class citizens. So the peninsulares hold the power. The Creoles are denied some of that power. And that's going to really tick the Creoles off and lead to some independence movements later in period 3. Okay, underneath the Europeans. Okay, so I'm just going to put European over here. You have the castas. Castas refers to the mixed races, and there are 3 categories of mixed races. The first are the mestizos. Mestizos are people of European descent and Native American descent. Okay, the majority population coming over to the New World from Spain and Portugal, there weren't a lot of women. The conquistadors, were there a lot of female conquistadors? No. Were there a lot of female explorers? No. Female captains of ships? No. Okay, then later when we get viceroys or governors in the New World, they are primarily made up of men. The judicial body, the audiencias, are made up of men. So you don't have a lot of women coming to the New World. Instead, you have a lot of European men. And those European men will have children with Native Americans and the African population in the New World, hence leading to this racial mixture. Okay, so you have European descent with Native American descent. That creates the class of mestizos. The second casta are the mulattoes. Okay, a historical term in this context, but not something that you use in the modern day. Okay, so this is only for use in period 2. Mulattoes is the mix between those of European descent and African descent. Okay, then third, the zombos. These are people of African descent and Native American descent. Then at the bottom, underneath the castas, are the indigenous, so the Native Americans, and then under them, the African population. What is this hierarchy based on? Is it based on money or title? No, it is based on race. Okay, so change over time. Native Americans are relegated to the bottom of society, whereas they used to control all of their society. And also you get new races introduced to the New World, whereas it had been completely 100% Native American prior to 1492. Now the Native American population is declining very rapidly, and instead you have a higher population of Europeans and Africans, okay, that have been forcibly imported. Are we good so far? Okay, so now we've talked about the Portuguese Empire. Let's talk about the Spanish Maritime Empire. So whereas the Portuguese have Brazil, okay, this area, the Spanish claim everything else. Okay, and this is due to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Basically, this is a line of demarcation drawn by the Pope and Portugal and Spain, saying everything in this direction beyond the line of demarcation is Spanish, and everything in this direction is Portuguese. So in order to prevent a war breaking out between the two foremost Catholic nations in Europe, the Pope got involved and was like, okay, the Portuguese get this. Now, why were the Portuguese okay with getting so little of the New World? Because they didn't think that the New World was going to make them as rich as their empire that they had built along Africa. So remember, they have this trading post Africa, trading post empire that gives them access to the Indian Ocean. Okay, so they bet that they're going to be able to get richer off of this. Spoiler alert, the Spanish get crazy rich off of the exploitation of the Americas. So the Portuguese made the wrong call there, but they are going to become very rich due to the asiento as well. Okay, so some of the justifications that were used for the expansion of the Spanish Empire included Christianity. Now, what type of Christianity were the Spanish interested in spreading? The Catholic, good. The Catholic religion. Okay, now at the same time, there is a religious schism happening in Europe. But wait, we already had a schism. We had the Great Schism in 1054. Well, that was between the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. Now we got a new one. In 1520, you have the Protestant Reformation. A monk by the name of Martin Luther in 1570 posted the 95 Theses, which was basically him throwing shade against the Catholic Church, saying that they were wrong. And we know that that's a big no-no. That is a heresy. Okay, so he is charged as a heretic, and he and his followers break off and form their own branch of Christianity known as Protestantism. So in Europe, you have literal wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, the Protestants who had been protesting what they considered to be Catholic corruption. If you've heard of the Puritans or Presbyterians or Methodists or Lutherans or Baptists, okay, Episcopalians, those are all Protestants that trace back to the Lutheran Church developing in the Protestant Reformation. So not only are the Spanish interested in keeping Europe 100% Catholic, they're fighting in Europe against the Protestants, they're also fighting to spread their faith in the New World, okay? But notably, in the New World, they can force conversions, okay, because of their military technology and their conquest of the Native Americans. But the other G in the three G's, other than God, is the desire for wealth, the desire for gold. That's also going to be a big motive behind exploration. Now, during this time, we see the rise of nationalism. Now, nationalism is different from patriotism. Patriotism is love of your country and respect for your country. The idea that your country is good or that it's great, right? Nationalism is the more extreme end of the spectrum there. Nationalism is when you think your country is the best or the greatest, and thus, by definition, everyone else is not as good. Everyone else is inferior. Okay, and so that's going to lead to some problems, some moral issues. Spanish nationalism tells them that they are better than the Native Americans, and so that allows them to justify the genocide that's perpetrated against the Native Americans and the enslavement of the Native Americans. The Portuguese believe that they are superior to the African peoples, and so that's going to lead to the asiento. It's also going to lead to conflict within Europe as one nation goes against another nation for that same belief of, oh, hey, we're better than you, right? In fact, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, the Nazi Party was nationalist. They believed that Germany and that Germans, specifically what they considered the Aryan race, were superior to all other peoples and all other races, thus culminating in the genocide of the Jewish population, the Roman population, those who are disabled, and the homosexual population, all thrown into camps under the idea of nationalism. Okay. Another motive behind exploration was finding a maritime route to Asia. Remember that the Portuguese found this route around Africa, and so the Spanish instead decided to go west. Instead of landing in Asia, they landed in the Caribbean. Okay. Now, as a result of all this gold and silver flooding into Spain, the Spanish are going to then use that gold and silver to buy stuff. Where do they want to buy stuff from? China. Remember, they want to get to Asia for a reason. And so China, inadvertently, even though China doesn't go in and conquer any of the New World, right? They're still going to profit off of exploration. because they're selling stuff to the Spanish. Where are the Spanish getting money in order to buy Chinese stuff? They're getting it from the New World. So China gets a lot of that silver as a result. Good so far? Now, whereas the Portuguese funded Diaz and da Gama and Amerigo Vespucci, the Spanish are going to sponsor Columbus, which again in 1492 landed in the Caribbean, insisted that he had landed in India. Magellan, who was the first one to sail all the way around the world, although technically he died in the Philippines. He was killed because he had ticked off some natives. But his crew continued that circumnavigation. Y'all know that to navigate means to go places, and circum means circle. So he traveled around the world. He started in Portugal, right here, went around the tip of South America. There was no way to get through the Yucatan Peninsula, and there was no Northwest Passage that they could find. So they had to go around South America and made it to Asia by going west. Okay, then once he gets to Asia, he continues through the Indian Ocean around the tip of Africa back to Spain. So he was the first, his crew was the first one to circumnavigate the world. Again, with conquistadors, remember that conquistadors are conquerors. We have the main ones, Cortes and Pizarro. In order to keep track of who conquered what, we use the mnemonic device MAC and PIP. Mexico, Aztec, Cortes. Cortes conquered Mexico after taking Montezuma, the leader of the Aztec, captive. Then in Peru, the Inca were captured by Pizarro. When he takes the leader Atahualpa hostage after Atahualpa already won the civil war against his brother in order to claim the throne, he demands a ransom in the form of an entire room being filled to the ceiling with gold and silver. Now, after he receives that ransom, Pizarro ends up killing Atahualpa anyway and taking over the Incan Empire. Okay, are we good so far? Do y'all see on this map how much of the New World was claimed by Spain? Okay, the lion's share. The Portuguese get Brazil. It is key that you remember that. All right, so now to go into more detail about the people sponsored by the Spanish Empire. First, obviously, we have to start with Christopher Columbus. Now, Christopher Columbus has become a controversial historical figure where some people see him as an Italian leader founding the New World and being key to the discovery of the Americas, and other people see him as a genocidal person who committed atrocities against the Native Americans. Now, a lot of people use the argument of, oh, we can't judge historical figures in the past based on today's standards, because like today, yes, they'd get canceled, but things are different. Well, y'all, even back then, even back in 1492, Christopher Columbus was arrested and imprisoned for the atrocities that he committed in the New World. Ferdinand and Isabella, the people who paid for him to sail west in the first place, imprisoned him and stripped him of his governorship in the New World because of the things that were being reported that he was doing in the colonies. Okay, that included sharpening their swords on people. They would test their swords' sharpness by cutting off Native Americans' ears and noses and hands and feet. If the Native Americans didn't bring them their quota of gold and silver, okay, they would lose limbs. They would sick dogs on them to tear their stomachs open, or they'd cut their stomachs open and allow the dogs to eat their innards. Babies were fed to dogs. Children as young as the age of 9 were sold into slavery, including sexual slavery, right? Okay, so even by those standards, Christopher Columbus was judged by his contemporaries, by the king and queen, that he was being paid to work for, and he was stripped of that governorship. Okay, so how did all of this come to be? Well, Spain was trying to compete with Portugal. Portugal was finding a route to Asia and becoming wealthy, And so Spain decided to sail west. So they pay for Christopher Columbus and give him ships and supplies in order to sail west to see what he can find, thinking that he could find the route to Asia. Now, he claims that he lands in India, but he really landed in the Caribbean people and came into contact with the Taino people, who he called Indians because he was mistaken in thinking that he was actually in Asia. Now, after that first expedition, he goes back 3 more times to continue mapping Central America, still unto his deathbed, claiming that he had made it to India. All right, later we find out, obviously he's wrong. Amerigo Vespucci, Pedro Cabral are like, actually this is a whole new thing. But the historical significance of this expedition was that by bringing back knowledge of this new world, this led to the sponsorship of further expeditions. So Christopher Columbus wasn't the first and last person to go to the Americas. Once he comes back to Spain and the Europeans figure out, hey, this is in India, they start sending more people to the West. And they're not just sending explorers, they start sending conquistadors, conquerors. So this leads to the exploration of the New World, but also the domination of the New World by the European powers. First Spain and Portugal, and then eventually the French, the English, and the Dutch. Are we good? Now, not everybody in this time period, not all Europeans were pro-domination of the New World. There were some Europeans who protested against the ruthless treatment of the Native Americans, most notably Bartholomew de las Casas. Okay, he was a former conquistador. He was a conquistador, and his father had been an explorer that had actually gone with Christopher Columbus to the New World on his second voyage after 1492. Okay, so Bartholomew de las Casas was an eyewitness, a first account witness of what was going on in the New World. Now, we don't have a lot of records from the Native Americans or the enslaved peoples about what went on during that time period because they didn't have the platform in order to get that information out to the world. But as a European Catholic priest, Las Casas was interestingly positioned in order to give this firsthand account and spread it amongst the Europeans. He personally petitioned the Pope to intervene and to end the encomienda system, which technically did get ended, but then it was just replaced with the hacienda system. So really he failed to end the exploitation of the New World, but he did try to document it and get the Catholic Church involved. So his documentation was the book, A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. And remember, they called it Indies because they believed that they had landed in India. So he publicly criticizes what is going on in the New World. He is the source that we get this information about the enslavement of the Native Americans and the maltreatment of the Native Americans, them dying off from smallpox, but also dying of the cruelty that is imposed on them by the conquistadors. Okay, so he publishes this book and it gets spread around Europe and it is used to condemn what is going on in the New World, particularly by the Protestants. Remember, the Protestants hate the Catholics and the Catholics hate the Protestants. They want to kill each other, right? And so the Protestants use this work by a Catholic priest as propaganda against the Catholics. This starts the quote unquote Black legend about how terrible Catholics are and how corrupt they are. It's used as evidence of, oh, look at what they're doing in the New World. They must be going to hell. They must be terrible. So they're like, oh, they're using Christianity. They are corrupting Christianity in order to make money, just like they've been doing in Europe with the indulgences. Okay, so they say, oh, the Spanish Catholics are using Christianity in order to justify the genocide of the Native Americans. What's hypocritical about this is that the Protestants do it too. When England starts colonizing the New World, do you think they're like, okay, we're going to treat the Native Americans as equals and be fair with them? No. So it's pretty hypocritical that even though the Protestant countries are like, Catholics, evil, because look, read the book, they are not going to apply that to themselves when they start colonizing. Okay. So Not all Europeans were pro-colonization, but again, the people that were against the colonization were the minority. They are going to continue exploiting the New World for the rise of their golden age, particularly in Spain. Are we good so far? Okay. So Spanish explorers. Ferdinand Magellan is going to be the first to circumnavigate the globe, even though technically he dies in the Philippines along the way. That is going to increase knowledge of the Pacific Ocean. So it's going to help cartographers and map makers. The conquistadors, like we said before, the main ones are Cortes and Pizarro. Remember that they conquered the Aztec and the Inca. First, Cortes conquers the Aztec in 1521. Then Pizarro conquers the Inca in 1532. So we see the fall of two mighty empires in the New World. There are some videos in the Schoology page on the Aztec and the Inca that I would highly recommend that y'all watch. Does anyone need this slide? Because it's on the Cornell notes. Good? Okay, so the first video I would recommend you watch is the one about the Aztecs. Just as a recap, the Aztec are in Central America. Remember that their capital was Tenochtitlan in the swampy lake of Texcoco, where they had built their chinampas. But when Cortes takes over Tenochtitlan, he's going to reclaim it for Spain, and it becomes modern day Mexico City. Now, even though Cortes only had like 200 men with him, okay, how was he able to conquer an empire with a city that had almost 250,000 people? Well, even more so than the military technology that they had that gave them an advantage, the spread of smallpox is going to give them a huge advantage. Yeah, Elizabeth, that's the right reaction right there. You're just like, what? Okay, so this is a picture of someone fighting smallpox. It is a pox. You have pustules covering the entire body. So not just the face. And look how crowded they are, right? It's not just like, oh, you get a little rash. Okay, it's the entire body. And these pox were so severe that even people who survived it were often scarred for life. Okay, Queen Elizabeth I of England got smallpox. And it scarred her so badly that for the rest of her life, she would cake her face with heavy white makeup, which unfortunately, had a bunch of lead in it. So that could lead to, some lead poisoning and some later mental issues that she had later in her reign. But this is going to devastate the American population because they don't have an immunity. Okay, are y'all ready to move beyond this picture, or you want to stare at it some more? Okay, then with the Incas, we have Pizarro with Atahualpa. Again, the Incas were in Peru, which is in South America. The Incan road system of the Carpanon is going to be used by the conquistadors to lead them to the Incan capital that allows them to take over. And then the Spanish are going to change the mita system, or the form of labor where men ages 15 to 50 would work for the state, into the slavery system of the encomienda. Good? Okay. So some economic effects of the exploration. If you talk about economic effects, you're primarily going to see positive effects for Europe, negative effects for the Americans. The age of exploration jumpstarts the golden age of Spain. Okay, the golden century of the 16th century, meaning the 1500s. Their Spanish army is able to increase as a result of the profit that's coming from the New World. They're going to build the Spanish Armada, which is the Spanish Navy, the most powerful navy in the world until this time. Okay, so they're going to dominate the sea with their military forces that are paid for by the exploitation of the New World. They're going to make it their mission to proselytize, to spread Catholicism, not only in the New World, but also in the fight against the Protestants, due to that wealth, being able to build up their economy. And that wealth is going to primarily comprise of precious metals from the New World. When we say precious metals, we're not talking copper or iron, we're talking bullion, gold and silver. Now, 20% of that gold and silver goes directly to the king and the queen. That's called the Quinto del Rey. That's Spanish for a fifth for the king. Okay, so 1/5 or 20% of all of the gold and silver that is collected is supposed to go directly to the king and queen. Okay, this makes up about 20% of their, or sorry, 25% of their total income. The remaining 80% goes to the government. It goes into the treasury, right? The people in the Americas don't get that money. They don't profit off of it. The purpose of the colonies under mercantilism is to enrich the mother countries, not the colonies. Okay. In addition to money that is flowing into the Spanish coffers at this time, through the Columbian Exchange, you also have the exchange of crops. And these crops, most notably the potato, are going to have a huge demographic impact on the old world. Okay, the potato is dense in calories. It has a very high caloric value, and it's also very easily grown. How many of you have ever like accidentally forgotten some potatoes in your cabinets in your kitchen, and you go back months later and you're like, oh dang, they're growing, you know, arms and legs down there. They're growing all these roots. Okay. Potatoes are tubers that can grow underground. They don't need the sun when they're first growing underground, and they can survive harsh weather, especially cold weather. So the Irish and the Russians are going to latch on to the potato, and it's going to lead to a huge population boom because they're able to grow it in the frozen Russian tundra. Okay. So because of the arrival of the potato from the New World to the Old World, like what we see with the banana culturally diffusing from Madagascar to Africa, we're going to see a population boom. More people means you need more stuff for the people, more food, but also more manufactured goods like clothing. Spain is not going to be able to produce as much clothing to support their population. And so if they can't make it themselves, they have to buy it from someone else. They have to import it, right? But no worries, because they got a ton of gold and silver coming from the New World. So whatever they can't make, they're going to buy, like from markets in India or markets in China. But here's the issue with that. It is bad economic policy to import more than you export, to buy more than you sell. Okay, eventually that gold and silver isn't going to be worth as much because of inflation. Since we have so much gold and silver coming in, that leads to a price revolution. The gold and silver undergoes inflation, which means it's going to be worth less than it was before. Okay, and inflation is something that occurs naturally. Like let's say 100 years ago, I had $100. Okay, I'd be doing pretty okay, especially as a woman back then. Right, in the 1900s, I'd be like, yeah, $100, that's good money, right? I'd go to college on that. But today, does $100 get you very far? No, not nearly as far. Okay, so the value of that currency decreases. So they have to spend more silver to get less stuff. So this hurts their economy. Prices and the cost of goods increases because they can't compete against the cheaper goods that are being produced elsewhere. Now, in terms of the effect this has on society, the rich people, the nobles, are actually going to be hurt because they are given money by their vassal lords, by the king and the queen, and they're given a fixed amount every year. So let's say they make $600 a year. They don't have to work for it, they just get it, right? Well, that $600 a year was probably great in the 1300s, but now in the 1500s, it's worth a lot less. Okay, so they become poorer. Even though they're getting the same amount of money, technically, they can't spend it on as much stuff. In contrast, the middle class increases in status because their debts have less value. Let's say I owe somebody $100 in the 1800s. If I owe someone $100 in the 1800s, I owe a lot of money. I'm never going to be able to pay that back. But let's say I owe somebody $100 today. All right, well, that's about as much as I make in a year as a teacher, but still, it's not an impossible amount to pay back. Okay, I'm not going to go bankrupt if I owe someone $100. Okay, so the middle class finds that their debts that are owned by the nobles decrease in value. Okay, so the nobles aren't getting as much money from the middle class paying off those debts. So the middle class is going to rise in power. Does that make sense so far? All right. Like the Incan Empire, once the Spanish Empire gets too big, it has to be divided up into smaller parts. And so the Spanish are going to divide their empire into 4 parts, into 4 viceroyalities. Think of a viceroyalty as a state. And at the head of each state, they have a governor, just like the United States is divided into 50 states, and we have our own governor, Kay Ivey, with the executive branch, right? Well, that governor, known as a viceroy for the Spanish, the viceroy is in charge of the viceroyalities, okay, the state. You can call it viceroy if you want, it's a written test. They are supposed to represent the will of the king. But in theory, that sounds good. But in actuality, how far away is the king from Mexico? Pretty far. It might take months. If you want to ask the king, hey, I need some advice on what crop to grow next year, and you send him a letter, it could take months for you to get a response, or the king could leave you on red, right? And so the viceroys are really the main power in the New World. And they're going to start saying things that are law by the king, but instead they're just corrupt. They're just ruling as they want to rule because the king is an entire ocean away. Okay, so in theory, they're supposed to represent the king, but they end up kind of, taking some of that power for themselves. They're not the only ones, though, that are supposed to be maintaining order in the New World. You also have the audiencias, which are the judicial branch of the New World. This is 12 to 15 judges. They're supposed to help the viceroy rule. So let's say someone breaks a law, okay, they would go before the judges to see what the punishment was. Okay, so you have an executive branch and a judicial branch in the New World. But remember, these governors aren't supposed to be making themselves rich. They're not supposed to be collecting the gold and silver and cash crops for themselves because they are the governor of a colony. They're supposed to send it back to the mother country because they're under mercantilism. They're supposed to take all this gold and silver and cash crops and send it back to Spain. Okay, but are they going to start becoming corrupt and skimming a little off the top and keeping some of that gold and silver for themselves? Yes, they are. Okay, but 1/5 of all the metals, all the gold and silver that make it to Europe, 20% goes directly to the king and the queen. So they're going to become crazy rich. Okay, but don't say that in your essay. Make it AP. Are we good so far? Okay, Spanish exploration and conquest relied very heavily on silver, even more so than gold, because there's more silver in the New World than gold. But again, unlike with the continent of Africa, the Spanish can go in and conquer large swaths of land in the New World and subjugate or dominate their populations for slave labor in the encomienda. Like we said before, the empire was divided into 4 states or viceroyalities, with each of them led by a governor known as the viceroy. Also ruling with them were the audiencias, who served as the judges and jury in the New World. But again, these governors did not rule the area for themselves. They reported back to the king and the queen because the purpose of the colonies is to make the mother country rich. And primarily that's going to be through gold and silver, but eventually that's going to shift over to cash crops, which is going to lead to the increase in coerced labor, first with the encomienda and then with the asiento. Okay, remember that the Americas produced raw goods, okay, crops. Those crops would then be sent in that 3rd leg of the triangular trade back to Europe, where the Europeans would manufacture them. So raw goods like sugar would go to Europe and be manufactured into alcohol, which would then be sold in Africa in exchange for slaves, which would lead to the Middle Passage, right? They also would ban their colonies from selling those goods to other European countries. Let's say France hits up a viceroy and says, hey, I want to buy some sugar from you and I'll give you $100 million, right? Well, no, you can't sell that sugar to the French you have to give it to the king and the queen. Okay, because under mercantilism, you're not supposed to make yourself wealthy. That's capitalism. It's not individuals. Okay, it is the country as a whole. So they would prevent competition from emerging in the New World. They said, no, you have to give your goods to us. Are we good so far? All right. Just as a recap of the social hierarchy that emerged in the New World, remember that the Europeans, okay, were at the top. This is a change over time. The Peninsulares were the Europeans born in Europe. The Creoles were Europeans born in the New World. So the Creoles had less power, and that's going to tick them off and eventually lead to revolt. Then you have the Castas, the mixed races, the mestizos, mulattoes, and the zombos. As it says in the chart, the mestizos are European and Native American heritage. What were the mulattoes? What heritage were they? We have three races: the Europeans, the Africans, and the Native Americans. Okay, mestizos are European plus Native. What are mulattoes? Good, Naomi. European and African. What about zombos? African and Native American. Then after or underneath the Castas, you have the Native Americans, and then the enslaved peoples forcibly brought over from Africa, most of which were working in plantations in the Caribbean or Brazil for cash crops. Good? Okay. Again, like we said before, the encomienda is a coercive labor system first used to enslave the Native Americans. At first, it was supposed to be mutually beneficial. They tried to create the encomienda to be like the feudalistic system. But remember, even the feudal system in Europe stopped being beneficial to both sides. It started benefiting one group of people over the other. Okay, so with the spread of the work by Bartholomew de las Casas, the Spanish government and the Catholic Church did try to rein in the encomienda system from savagely exploiting the Native Americans, but that reining in didn't really work like it was supposed to. Okay, the idea was that the Native Americans were supposed to work for the Spanish for like 6 days out of the week, and then they'd get a day off to work on their own land. Okay, so the Europeans thought that they were doing them a favor, that they were civilizing them. They said, oh, look at these backwards Native Americans. They don't know about the ownership of land. They share it with the community. That's not how it's supposed to work. They don't know about Jesus. We're going to save their souls, right? We're going to protect them. So it was seen as if the Europeans were doing a favor to the Native Americans. Okay, that's how they justified this exploitation, and that the Native Americans would become civilized and they would work for the Spanish settlers first, and then they could work a little bit for themselves on their day off. But in reality, it becomes a slave system. Okay, Native Americans die off from disease and conquest and extremely poor treatment. And so their population, as well as their culture, is almost completely wiped out. Now, the Catholic Church does end the encomienda, but then it just pops up by different names, like the hacienda and the repartimiento. Okay, so we still see that exploitation. Eventually, the Spanish Empire is going to move away from the encomienda and towards the asiento as the native population decreases, because the encomienda is notorious for brutality and harsh living conditions. Now, this chart is available in Schoology. I have that under our lecture series, so if you want to add that to your Cornell notes, that's available there.